Good morning, everybody. Buenos días. Guten Morgen. Why don't we get started this morning with our last Sunday school of this, not this year, but this school year. We go by the school year, so we'll come back to Sunday school in September, Lord willing. If you come for Sunday school next week, that means you're coming to the Spanish ministry. So we invite you and we welcome you to join us in the Spanish ministry. We start at 9, not 9:30, but you're very welcome to join us. That would be a blessing. But this is our last Sunday school for this part of the school year until our summer break, or during our summer break. And I have not done Sunday school for 2 weeks because Pastor College did it last week, talking about the law of God. And the week before that was Matthew Brennan from the Emerald Isle, who spoke to us about the Lord's work in Ireland. If you recall, the last time that I did Sunday school in April, it was about the original historical context of the first London Confession of Faith, which was published in 1644. The first London Confession of Faith in 1644. If you remember, the particular Baptist churches were responding in part to the Westminster Assembly. The Westminster Assembly was considering, in cooperation with Parliament, legislation to suppress and handle what they called Anabaptist and antinomian theology. And so the particular Baptists were publishing their confession of faith to vindicate themselves and say, we're not the heretics that you think we are. We're not the heretics that people say we are. Rather, here's what we believe. We will openly confess it. They gave the names of ministers from 7 churches, so it was a very public declaration of their orthodox beliefs. That was the first London Confession in 1644. Now, what we're going to talk about this morning is the second London Confession, which was first published in 1677. And this is our confession of faith, which our church uses. It's usually called the 1689 Confession, but it was actually never published in 1689. It was first published in 1677. You can see here, this is a picture of a first edition of our Confession of Faith, published in 1677. This book is at the Huntington Library in San Marino, one of the best places on earth after Ireland. And you can't go see it, but I had the privilege and opportunity of going to see it, and it's there. It's a beautiful book, and you can see a picture of it. It's about the size of an iPhone 10 cover, just a little bit wider. So it's not very big, if you can see my hands. It's like this size, fairly small book. But that's our Confession of Faith published in 1677. And this PowerPoint presentation will explain to you if they had a Confession of Faith, why did they publish another one? What was the need? What was the purpose? What was the cause of that? And some of you may have seen this before. I don't recall if I presented this material at our church, but for others it will be new or a refresher. So let's go to the next slide. What are the purposes of Sunday school this morning? I want you to understand the historical circumstances that led to the Baptists' second confession of faith. Why did they bother? They weren't sitting around one day and said, you know what? Let's make a new confession of faith. There are reasons that led them to this. I want us to see, based on the historical circumstances, we need to better understand what the confession is and what it is not. And then we need to understand how that historical context has affected editorial decisions. Why did they say certain things and not other things? Or why did they say certain things the way that they said them? The historical context helps us to understand that. Let's advance. So, to understand the historical context of the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, we need to begin in 1674, 3 years before its publication, with a particular Baptist minister named Thomas Collier. Thomas Collier. I'm going to train you, when you hear that name, to go, hiss at him. Thomas Collier. It's like when the Jews read Esther and Mordecai's name anyway. You can ask Keith about that. Thomas Collier was a particular Baptist minister who had been sent out by the London churches to plant churches and to be sort of a kind of like a regional coordinator of particular Baptist churches since the 1640s. So by 1674, he's been around several decades. He has published many books. He has planted many churches. He's been very involved in particular Baptist life. He's well known in the particular Baptist community as well as outside of it, especially through his publications. Well, in 1674, Thomas Collier published another book after having published many others, and he called it The Body of Divinity. Now, if you're familiar with book titles from that period, this title instantly tells you basically this is a systematic theology, a body of divinity. It's a book that will teach you theology in a comprehensive way. And it was 606 pages. It's a very substantial volume, and it contained 31 articles of Collier's beliefs. This is what I believe, a body of divinity in 31 articles or chapters totaling 606 pages. And Thomas Collier had in the past, in some of his writings, he had taught heretical things or things that approximated, got close to heresy, and he had been confronted and corrected for those things in the past, and he had retracted his previous problematic or truly bad teachings. But here in 1674, he says this in his preface. He says, "Whatever may be found in any other of my writing that may seem contrary to anything in this, or is contrary in very deed, either understand it by this or else let it fall to the ground." So in 1674, he's saying, whatever I've said in the past, I want you to understand my theology based on what I'm saying now. What I'm saying now is what I believe, even if what I said in the past was different. Whatever I believe, it's this, now in 1674. Let's move on. The problem was, in this book, Collier espoused, he advanced very problematic teachings. And one of the issues in Collier's writings, it's not that he always openly embraced heresy. Oftentimes, he would just use very poor expressions or very confusing expressions and almost make contradictory assertions. His work was just a mess. It was a mess. For example, he says here, Thomas Collier says, "It is necessary for everyone to be established in this truth, that there is a God, so likewise that there is but one God and not a plurality of gods." Very good. That's great. And then he says, although in this one God, there is a plurality of titles and varieties of discoveries, properties, and operations. You'd say, okay, that's modalism. And then he would say, "Yet I dare not say of persons or distinct subsistings." So the distinction of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is a distinction of titles, not a distinction of persons or subsistings. But then he goes on to pretty much develop a fairly orthodox doctrine of the Trinity after that. So you would read this and say, what are you talking about? That's really, really bad theology. You should not publish something like that, especially if what you say after it doesn't even make sense in comparison. So the point is simply to use this as an illustration of the problematic nature of Collier's book. A big systematic theology published by Collier with heretical teachings, or at least things that are getting close to heresy. Next slide, please. Here's the title page of Thomas Collier's book. Take a look at this closely. He calls it The Body of Divinity, or, subtitle, A Confession of Faith, being the substance of Christianity, containing the most material things relating to matters both of faith and practice, published for the benefit and profit of all. Now, what does that look like? It's not just what it looks like. What is that? You have a book that is publicly published, that's redundant, but it's published to the world under the subtitle of A Confession of Faith, which is proposing itself to be a complete body of divinity for the benefit and profit of all. So everyone here, you should know, this is the faith, this is the Christian faith, a confession of faith. It seems to represent all of the particular Baptists, doesn't it? Or at least it could be misconstrued. People know Collier is prominent. People know that he has been around for a long time. People know that he's a particular Baptist. So other people will interpret all of the particular Baptists based on Collier's confession of faith. Next slide, please. Now, he received pushback for his body of divinity. Collier was confronted about some of the things that he said because it's best to ask before you accuse. And so people went to him and said, the things that you've said in your book, The Body of Divinity, seem very wrong. Is this what you meant? Did you actually mean these things, or did you just use very poor phrases? So Collier publishes, again, an additional word to the Body of Divinity. So it's an appendix, an additional word to the Body of Divinity or Confession of Faith, etc. Let's proceed. Well, unfortunately, the additional word to the Body of Divinity just made things worse. He did not clarify or retract his poor expressions and his errors. Rather, he only deepened in more clearly embracing heretical teachings. And so after that point, after he did not retract, but rather furthered in error, particular Baptists began to respond to him. So we're now in September, the 5th of September, 1676, so 2 years after the initial publication of that first book. And several ministers out in the country, they met together to talk about, ministers around where Collier was serving, and they said, what should we do about Collier and his books? So they wrote a letter to London about the problem. The elders in London, they sent out a letter to the particular Baptist churches, and they said that Thomas Collier has made himself to be a heretic, and the London elders said, we're going to publish a book in response to Collier to detect or to show his errors. Let's move forward. So just to give you an idea of the geography with my beautiful Google Maps and paint skills, what are we talking about here? Obviously, we have the London. London is the heart of particular Baptist life. The 7 London churches published the first London Confession of Faith there. Well, we're 30 years later. There's many more churches. They've expanded throughout the country. But Thomas Collier and the country ministers that we're discussing are serving here in the West. In a different Sunday school lesson, we talked about the Western Association briefly and how they used the Confession of Faith. This is the western area of Bristol and Bath. If you ask Owen what his favorite place was that we went to in London in January, he'll probably say Bath. That's how they always pronounce it. You can't say Bath. They know you're an American if you say Bath. They all say Bath. Anyway, down here is Bradford-on-Avon, where Robert Striven's ministers. We pray for him regularly. I preached for him in January. And in the same area is where Thomas Collier was serving. So you have Bristol. After London, Bristol is the second most strongest and most prominent center of particular Baptist life. And you have Thomas Collier causing trouble down here, country ministers meeting about it, writing to London, sending letters back and forth and saying, we're going to publish a book about Collier's heresies. Let's zoom in a little bit in the next picture. Okay, we've just zoomed in. Here's London still on the right. And now here's Bristol and Bath. And here's Warminster. Warminster is where the elders met to talk about Collier, and then they sent a letter to London. Over here is where Collier was ministering. Next. So remember, 5th of September, 1676, the country elders write to London. London elders say, we're going to deal with this. The London elders send a group to go confront Collier out at his church. And this confrontation happened in October of 1676. And to do this, the London elders, they appointed one of their own, to be sort of the spokesman, to be the polemicist, you might say, against Thomas Collier. And this person whom they chose was named Nehemiah Cox. When you hear the name Nehemiah Cox, you go, yay, we like him. He's a good guy. And Thomas Collier said of Nehemiah Cox, whom probably they thought more accomplished for their design than themselves. Now, Cox was a very young man at this time. He was born in 1650, so he's 26 years old, and yet Collier, who is much older than him, is saying that the older London elders thought that Cox, the young man, was more accomplished for interacting with Collier's heresies than even they themselves were. So this meeting took place, and it didn't resolve anything. Collier did not retract. His church was split over the issue. They didn't have a sufficient majority to deal with Collier. So the meeting didn't really accomplish anything there. But the London elders went back to London, and they said, we're going to publish the book that we said we would publish, since you have still not retracted your errors. Next, please. Southwick is where Thomas Collier was ministering. I got the chance to go to, not the original building, that's gone, but the successor of the Southwick Particular Baptist Church is, this church is here, and that's yours truly, standing in front of it. They have a baptistry going this way from the camera, and they have a graveyard going that way. So it was neat to say, okay, I'm here at the Southwick Church. Thomas Collier ministered here. Cox confronted him, not in this building, but nearby, very nearby. Next, please. So Nehemiah Cox published the critique, and now we've entered into 1677. October 1676 was the confrontation. In the next year, Nehemiah Cox publishes his criticism or his critique of Thomas Collier. It's called Vindicii Veritatis, a vindication of the truth, or a confutation of the heresies and gross errors asserted by Thomas Collier in his additional word to his body of divinity. So notice the progression. It's Thomas Collier's additional word to his body of divinity, where Collier doubled down on his errors. It's that, more than anything, that Nehemiah Cox is responding to. And in his preface, or in a preface to his book, some of the London elders wrote a preface, and they said that Nehemiah was not so much prompted to this work by his natural inclination as by the joint and earnest persuasion of several of the elders and that of elder years. So the older men were saying, we want you to write this book. We want you to do this work for us. We think you are fit for it, because it would be viewed as very prideful and indeed inappropriate for a young man like Cox to just say, here, I'll do it. I'll write against this older man in the faith. But rather, other London elders who were his elder in age were saying to Nehemiah Cox, we think that you have the gifts to do this. We want you to do it. And that's what they're explaining. So Cox critiques Collier. Next, please. Collier responds to Cox. Blog post, blog post, blog post, blog post. And Collier calls it a sober and moderate answer to Nehemiah Cox's invective, pretended, refutation, as he saith, of the gross errors and heresies asserted by Thomas Collier, etc. Collier was very provoked. Collier was very upset by Nehemiah Cox's book. And Collier said about Cox's book, he said, not any book in our age can parallel it by far for falsehood, mocking, scornful pride, scurrility, malignancy, and reproach, and that under pretense of zeal for God. So Collier reads Cox's book as just a prideful little youth telling him what's what and who's who and why's why. And then he makes fun of his age. Mr. Cox, he says he is a young man, and probably so young that his head might scarce be warm at that time. Collier's saying he's a baby. His hair hasn't even grown in. Great. Good job, everyone. We're really, like I said, blog post, blog post, blog post, blog post. Nothing changes. There's nothing new under the sun. Next. Okay, so at this point, the Baptists are organizing more and more to handle the Collier situation. We're still in 1677. Cox has published his refutation of Collier. Collier has responded, again, not in any way retracting his heresies or his errors, but deepening himself in them, which in a way is an advantage to the particular Baptist, because it just more clearly shows he's not one of us. But they still had work to do. 2nd of August, 1677, the London elders meet with the Bristol elders and others in the country. So they go to Bristol. Remember, if you can imagine the map, here was London, here was Bristol. They go to Bristol, and they have a meeting in 2nd August, 1677, in Bristol. And Mr. Cox is said to be chief in this meeting. What they did at the meeting is they drafted a letter that we've actually read part of that letter in one of our previous lessons. That's the letter that defined what heresy is and then applied that definition to Thomas Collier. If you remember, I gave you a long list of definitions of heresy, and then I said, and here's a particular Baptist definition of heresy, which is the same as all these other ones. That was coming from the letter that was drafted and sent by this 2nd August meeting of particular Baptist Bristol and London elders. So they send out a letter to all the churches saying, this is what heresy is, this is what a heretic is, Thomas Collier is guilty of these things. 2nd August, 1677. Well, that same month, the 26th of August, 1677, in Nehemiah Cox's church, under his own hand, you're seeing his handwriting here, he wrote in their church book, it was agreed that a confession of faith with the appendix thereto, having been read and considered by the brethren, should be published. Street racers. So why is it that a confession of faith is approved for publication in August of 1677? Well, it's not a mystery. It's because the particular Baptists were organizing to handle Thomas Collier's very public heterodoxy and heresy, which he had published under the title of, or subtitle of, or a Confession of Faith. So our second London Confession of Faith was necessary to be published. It needed to be published because of the heterodoxy and the public heresy of Thomas Collier and his publications. And you can see here the historical context. Let's move on to the next slide. So here's a recap of what we've just seen. Collier publishes in 1674. He gives an additional word which only worsens things 2 years later. The ministers in the country contact London. The London elders meet with Collier. He doesn't retract. Cox publishes against Collier. Collier responds. He doesn't retract. 2nd August, the London and Bristol and country elders meet. And then that same month, the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith is approved for publication in the Petty France Church, with Nehemiah Cox's hand making that entry in the church book. This is important to understand the ideological context, the things that were in their mind as they came to editing and publishing the Confession of Faith. The Confession of Faith is responding to heresy, and it is embracing and putting forth orthodoxy. In that letter that was sent out by the elders from the Bristol meeting and sent to Collier's church, they said, "We conceive that he is a heretic that chooses an opinion by which some fundamental article of the Christian religion is subverted." Remember that definition. Heresy is an error that overturns, it's choosing and persisting in an error that overturns the fundamental articles of Christian religion. That's the letter to Collier's church. What does the confession say in its preface? Our confession says in its preface that we are publishing this to manifest our consent with both, that's with the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, in all the fundamental articles of the Christian religion. They're saying we're not heretics, we are publishing our orthodoxy, very similar to the first London Confession. They said later in the confession, in the fundamental articles of Christianity, we mind the same things and have therefore expressed our belief in the same words that have on the like occasion been spoken by other societies of Christians before us. So the particular Baptists are saying we're going to use the Westminster Confession of the Presbyterians and the Savoy Declaration of the Congregationalists, which had already borrowed from the Westminster Confession, and we're going to use those same words because we believe the same things as them and we want to show that we agree with them. So the particular Baptists are connecting themselves to Protestant orthodoxy in the context of a very public heresy in their own midst. Next, please. They also are making it clear, we want you to understand our theology based on what we say here in our confession and not based on what some other person who goes under the name of a particular Baptist has said. So in the appendix to the confession, they said, we want you to learn about our theology from ourselves, who jointly concur in this work. This represents our common faith, and that you may not be misguided, either by undue reports or by the ignorance or errors of particular persons who, going under the same name with ourselves, may give an occasion of scandalizing the truth we profess. They're talking about Thomas Collier. They're saying, don't judge us based on Thomas Collier's writings. Rather, judge our orthodoxy and our theology based on this confession of faith. As Nehemiah Cox said, there can be no gospel peace without truth, nor communion of saints without an agreement in fundamental principles of the Christian religion, and the confession provides precisely that. Next, please. So this helps us, this historical context helps us to understand what the confession is, as well as what the confession is not. So the confession is a declaration of Catholic orthodoxy. It's not a polemical document. It is Catholic in the sense of common and shared. We share in the orthodoxy of the church through this confession. The confession is not designed to attack other groups, but rather to unite with other Protestant Orthodox groups. The confession is not attacking, but rather joining with others. Similarly, the confession of faith is a declaration of doctrinal fundamentals. It is not an exhaustive system addressing every single question or possible belief. That does not mean that every single thing stated in the confession is a fundamental or is as fundamental as the rest, but rather it is attempting to be an expression of the fundamental articles of religion. It's not intended to be an exhaustive systematic theology. Similarly, it is a declaration of common agreement or belief in those fundamentals, not the views of one person. Remember that Thomas Collier's book, whom did it represent? Just Thomas Collier. It was just his beliefs. Whereas if we could go back one slide, remember they said that we jointly concur in this work. We can go forward again. The confession represents many churches. It's a common confession of many churches, not just one person or not even just one church. So it's something that many hold in common as particular Baptists. It's also something that connects them with the larger church. And this means that the confession of faith is a cohesive whole. It's not a set of disconnected points. So if you deny something in one part of the confession, it very often has a domino effect or a chain reaction of what it leads to in other parts of the confession. That's a case-by-case situation, but it means that it's intended to be a system. It's intended to be a complete, cohesive presentation of theology, not just, well, we believe this over here, and we believe that over there, and we believe this over here. No, rather, it builds itself as it progresses through its chapters, through its articles, into a cohesive whole. Next, please. Because of the historical context of the Confession of Faith, we can better understand some of the decisions for why it was edited the way that it was edited. It wouldn't really be accurate to say the confession was written. It's more edited. It's more a combining of previous documents than it is writing new material, although there is new material in the confession, just not much of it. So in the choices that were made to edit the confession, to put it together by a process of editing, you can see that the confession avoids a specific critique of infant baptism. Now, it's clearly espousing credo baptism. We're not saying that it allows for infant baptism. But its concern is not to attack infant baptism. That's not what the confession is doing. The confession confesses credo baptism, and then they added an appendix afterwards that dealt with a few arguments relating to infant baptism. You might say, well, why doesn't the confession attack paedobaptism? That's not the point. That wasn't the historical context. That wasn't the purpose. They're not trying to attack Presbyterians or Congregationalists or Anglicans. Rather, they're uniting with Protestant orthodoxy. Similarly, the confession avoids the question of the relation between baptism and church membership. This was a controversy during that time. It's been a controversy ever since, among Baptists especially. For those who come to the table, to the Lord's Supper, should we allow those who were baptized as infants to come to the supper? Should we accept their baptisms as improper but valid in a sense? Or should we just... There are different positions that one takes. The point is, the confession intentionally avoids that issue because there were particular Baptists of different opinions on it, and they couldn't unite in the confession if the confession took one particular stand on that. So the Bristol churches, especially, remember, in the West, the Bristol churches, they tended to be more open communion, whereas the London churches in the East, they tended to be more closed communion. But the confession is uniting these particular Baptists so they avoid that issue. Otherwise, they couldn't say, we who jointly concur in this work. Similarly, the confession avoids the question of laying hands on those who are baptized. Some particular Baptist churches practiced laying on of hands after baptism. Some didn't. They didn't make it a point because that would disunite them. And those things are not as fundamental as other articles. Similarly, the confession avoids the question of singing in public worship. The particular Baptists in that time, most of their churches did not sing at all. They had no singing in their public worship for various reasons, but some of them did. And so in order to unite in the confession, they avoided that question. This is important because sometimes you look at the confession and you think, why didn't they say what they believed? Well, because not all of them believed that particular point. And not having it in the confession didn't mean that a given church, or to put it a different way, you can have the confession of faith and then a given church can still practice those particular things one or the other way, and it's not a problem. Next. I want you to, based on this, I want to encourage you to appreciate our confession of faith, because we need to understand that our confession of faith is not a particularly Baptist document. What is particularly Baptist about it? Not much. It contains the fundamental articles of the Christian religion, the vast majority of which is just used from the Savoy Declaration, which is coming from the Westminster Confession, which is coming from the Irish Articles and the 39 Articles, which is based on creedal confessional Christianity before that. And so our confession is not disuniting or disconnecting us from the rest of the church. If it were a particularly Baptist document, it would say, this is us, and kind of raise the castle walls and close off from others, as opposed to our confession really is embracing the common language of Christianity in the Protestant, Reformed, Puritan, Baptist tradition and beyond. So to take the confession upon our mouths and speak it is simply to speak Christianese. So many other Christian churches will use the same exact confessional and creedal language. And so we appreciate our confession more when we see it as something that we have in common with other churches today and throughout history. It's not a particularly Baptist document. It's not particularly Baptist, but it is a particular Baptist document. And you should appreciate it for that reason. Why? It does have a few of our distinctives. What is distinctive about the confession? Well, obviously it's credo baptism, and it's congregationalism. The congregationalism, even that's not particularly Baptist. You have John Owen and Thomas Goodwin and Jeremiah Burroughs and Philip Nye and Samuel Bolton, all of those Congregationalists and others. They practiced congregationalism. That's in our confession. It's really our credo baptism, which is just proportionally how much of our confession is credo baptism. Very, very little. Very little. But it is a particular Baptist document. And I want you to know, and if you did not already know, that to embrace and confess our confession of faith is to join an unedited particular Baptist heritage. That picture I showed you of the confession at the Huntington Library, the 1677, if you open it up and read it, it's the exact same text that we use today. It's unedited. It's unchanged. The Westminster Confession has been changed many times and in many different ways. Many other confessional documents have been changed, and sometimes there's good reason to do so. I'm just pointing out to you that our confession of faith has been faithfully used and appreciated by Baptist churches from the first day that it was published until now without a single change to it. There were some Baptists who added 2 articles. You may have heard of the Philadelphia Confession. It added an article about singing and an article about laying on hands, things that were left out from the confession. But they didn't change the actual text of the confession itself. They just added 2 more articles to it. So our confession of faith is something that we could go back to those churches and say we believe the same things that you believe with the same words, and that's something worth receiving and worth transmitting to the next generation. It has stood the test of time. It has been a faithful guide and a faithful tool for expressing what the Scriptures teach and teaching what the Scriptures teach. Next, please. Remember the overall context of our Sunday school lessons since we resumed Sunday school this year. We started out talking about Jesus' prayer for unity and how Jesus prays that the church would be one as he and the Father are one. And we've been talking about how can Christians unite. We talked about symbolic unity, that confessions of faith are symbols. They are some summaries, a small, in a glimpse, representation of the faith. And so symbolic unity, confessional unity. We receive a form of sound words and we transmit. We receive the symbol, we transmit the symbol. We receive a confession, we transmit it according to the apostles commands to find faithful men, teach them the pattern of sound words, and have them teach it on to subsequent generations. And so our confession of faith is one part of our attempt to be faithful to Jesus' prayer and the apostles' commands to receive and transmit a form of sound words which represent the teachings of Scripture. We've also talked in our Sunday school lessons about the relationship between Scripture and tradition, what God has said, and our attempts to understand it, not isolated, not blindly, but in conversation with Christianity and its history of interpretation. So our confession of faith does not disconnect us from history, but rather it connects us to history. We're not starting over. We're not reinventing the wheel. And even our confession was not starting over. It was not reinventing the wheel. Our confession connects us to the tradition and the history of the church, which is grounded in the Scriptures. Our confession of faith helps us to appreciate sola scriptura, that the Scripture is the ultimate and final and only infallible rule of our faith. And thereby we avoid sola scriptura, only the Bible, no creed but the Bible. We avoid that. Or nuda scriptura, only the words of the Bible can be used. No, rather our confession of faith uses more expanded vocabulary and language to better express the faith with precision, and it does it in concert with the tradition of the church. And so therefore, by confessing the confession, we confess sola scriptura, and we reject solo scriptura or nuda scriptura, and we thereby avoid isolationism or individualism. We don't cut ourselves off from other churches or the history of the church. We connect to it, and we don't follow the faith of one charismatic leader or one really bright and persuasive and loquacious leader. We don't say, wow, this person really knows it all. Rather, our confession of faith is a collective common document that represents the faith of many people who have worked together to produce that document. So we avoid isolationism. We use it to cooperate with other churches. We avoid individualism because it's not one man's theology. It's rather the theology of generations of Christians. We've talked about, in our Sunday school lessons, we've talked about heresy. What is heresy? It's to choose and persist in an error which overturns the fundamentals. By confessing our confession, we affirm the fundamentals and preserve the fundamentals and stay away from heresy. We've talked about schism, and I found it more difficult to define than I expected. But we noticed that schism ultimately breaks a bond of fellowship. And our confession of faith helps us to establish a bond of fellowship rather than breaking bonds of fellowship. We get to, as an individual church, we unite in a confession of faith. As an association of churches, we unite in a confession of faith. In cooperation with OPC or PCA or URC or other like-minded churches, we cooperate them because our unity with them is so visible. It's not as complete because their confessions are distinct, but so much of what we believe is the same that it enables us to cooperate. It enables us to relate to them and to interact with them with knowledge. People think that differences will divide us. They distinguish us. They don't have to divide us. When we define our differences, then we can more openly and clearly interact with one another and cooperate with one another. So we're trying to avoid schism by using our confession of faith. Could our confession of faith be used in a schismatic way? It could, but that's not what we're trying to do. Next, please. So we'll conclude with this. Here are some pictures of the title pages of our confession of faith. It was published 3 times in the 17th century, never in 1689. Sorry, bad news. If you got a tattoo, I feel bad for you. Here is 1677, a confession of faith. Notice this, put forth by the elders and brethren of many congregations. Not Thomas Collier's confession of faith, not Sam Renihan's confession of faith, but rather it's a common document. This is the copy in the Huntington. If you opened up, this is what you see. The Christians baptized upon profession of their faith in London and the country. It's not just the London churches. It's London and the country. Elders and brethren of many congregations have all confessed their faith. This book, if you keep paging through it, it's the exact same words that we continue to confess today without change. It was published again in 1688. 1688. Same text, same everything. It was published for a third time in the 17th century. See, it says the third edition in 1699. It's easy to remember, 77, 88, 99, just like 44 was the first one. Now, why do we call it the 1689 Confession of Faith? Well, it's because in 1689, up until 1689, let me start over. Remember that in the 1640s, the Presbyterians were considering legislation to suppress Anabaptism. And so the Baptists were under threat of persecution. I'm going to summarize when the Church of England came back to power in the restoration of Charles II in the 1660s, the Church of England persecuted all nonconformists, Presbyterians, Independents or Congregationalists, and Baptists, particular or general. So when the Church of England was restored, when the monarchy was restored, all nonconformists or dissenters, their meetings were illegal, and they could not meet. Fast forward again to 1689, when William III comes to power, James II is ousted, and the Act of Toleration is put into place. The Act of Toleration in 1689 gives freedom to nonconformists to meet and to worship God according to their conscience without fear of persecution. They're allowed to meet. And so in 1689, the particular Baptists organized a national General Assembly, and they brought as many messengers from the churches as they could to London. They had a General Assembly for a week in September 1689, and they published a narrative of their General Assembly afterwards. And in that brief narrative, they said, this confession of faith, they said, is ours and it belongs to us. And they published a long list of all the churches and all the pastors of those churches in that narrative. Now, in 1677 or even 1688, if you published a list of the churches and the ministers, what would you be doing? You'd be giving the government a hit list. Not to come kill you, but to come seize your goods and persecute you. So the first two iterations of the confession were anonymous, no names, no places. But in the third edition, they have, long after 1689, they do have the names and places of the churches. So in 1689, that's when they sort of publicly owned the confession and said, this is our confession, it belongs to us, even though it had been published back in 1677. So it's okay if you call it the 1689. Your tattoo is fine. It's all right. It just was never published in 1689. 77, 88, 99. A confession of faith put forth by the elders and brethren of many congregations of Christians baptized upon profession of faith in London and the country. I believe that's all. Is there any other slide, Hayden? Is that all? No, we're done. Okay. So we don't really have time for questions, but I'm happy to answer them after the sermon this morning. I'd be happy to talk about these things plenty. So write down your questions, bring them to me at a different time, but we'll stop here. I hope you've enjoyed getting to know the history of our confession of faith. We still confess the same confession without editing, without changing it, which I think is a blessing. And we can understand what the confession is and is not based on its historical context. One last thing that I didn't mention is that in the preface to the confession, they say that copies of the first London Confession were scarce and rarely to be had. So they couldn't just give out the first London Confession. There weren't many copies of it left. Remember, it was a pamphlet. It wasn't bound. It's just papers stitched together. Those kinds of books don't survive very well. If you just have a stack of papers and you staple them together, after 30 years, how well preserved will that stack of papers be? Probably not too well. So the first London Confession had not survived very well, physically speaking. It just wasn't commonly had. They thought it better to publish a new confession that would clearly show we don't believe what Collier believes. This is what we believe. We unite with the Congregationalists. We unite with the Presbyterians. And here is our confession of faith. And we thank the Lord that we continue to use it today. Thank you very much. That will conclude our Sunday school lessons until September.